We are back again to continue reading Willa of the Wood. And if you remember from last time, our friend Nathaniel, the day folk, was getting ready to head off to town. So I'm sure Willa is sure to be in for a big adventure through these next couple of chapters. So let's pick up our copy and turn to chapter 47. Starts on page 236 in my copy, and we'll start reading. Willa woke early the next morning when it was still dark and went downstairs. Outside, the sounds of the night had died down hours before, but the sound of the morning birds had not yet begun. An eerie silence held sway. Standing in the kitchen, she watched Nathaniel in silence as he packed supplies into his leather knapsack for his long journey through the forest down to Gatlinburg. "I'll see you when I get back," he told her gently. She nodded quietly. "I know you know how to take care of yourself in these woods, but if those loggers come around here causing trouble when I'm gone, then you do that thing you do. Make yourself scarce." "I will," she agreed. Making herself scarce, as he called it, was just about the only thing she was good at. She watched Nathaniel grab his rifle and head out the door with Scout at his side, the dog content to go wherever he was going. She followed them out, and they then stood in the yard. Seeing them fade into the thickness of the forest, she felt in a peculiar pang in her heart that she'd never felt before, and she prayed they'd be safe. She'd never been to Gatlinburg, but she'd seen it from a distance. Why would he go to there? As she went back into the house and walked through it alone, she was struck by how different it seemed, so quiet and lifeless now. It felt like a hollow wooden cave long abandoned by those who had once lived there. She didn't want to stay in the house without Nathaniel and Scout there, so she went back outside. One by one, the birds began to sing and chirp and whistle in the darkness, each one making itself known to the others around it, until the morning light began to fill the sky above the trees. She felt an unusual relentless. She wasn't sure what to do or where to go. She fed the goats and chickens and then made her way to the river. She gazed at the water flowing among the large boulders, then walked along the river's path. She traveled downstream, staying close to the river's edge. She had intended to walk just a little ways, but once she started, she couldn't stop. She just kept walking, pushing herself hard. She went hour after hour, the cold water of the river soaking her feet and legs when she crossed through its shallow pools, and the rough surface of the jagged rocks abrading the bare skin of her hands as she climbed over them. She didn't know what she was looking for, but Nathaniel had done it every day, and it felt right to be doing it in his stead, taking the same course he had taken. As she journeyed down the river, she kept a sharp eye out for whatever Nathaniel might have been looking for. She was determined to figure it out. She saw a family of raccoons, a mother and 3 little ones, foraging for crawfish in the shallows with their tiny hands. Another time she spotted a fox staring at her from the undergrowth. She often heard the rapping of the woodpeckers, which always brought a smile to her face. But then she heard a different kind of sound in the distance. She stopped and listened, tilting her head. It was coming from across the river, a dull, repetitive thudding sound echoing ominously through the forest. Her stomach wrenched into a twisting knot. It was the sound of axes cutting into the living body of trees. She sucked in a quick breath and pulled back from the river into the underbrush of the forest. The loggers were getting closer every day. Nathaniel had warned her to stay clear of them, and she'd seen their destruction with her own eyes. She had no want to see it again. She turned and fled through the forest for home, glancing back over her shoulder as she ran. Sometimes she paused near a tree, blended into the bark, and waited just long enough to listen, and then continued on. As she made her way, she wondered if Nathaniel had been journeying down the river every day to guard and protect his land from the loggers. But she didn't think so. He always went downstream and always stayed close to the water. But she knew much of his property was upstream as well. By the time she got back home, she was wet and exhausted, with no more understanding than when she ventured out. Her journey down the river had been a failure. When she came to the grove of sourwood trees that grew near the house, she finally slowed to a walk and caught her breath, relieved to be back. As she made her way across the open grass towards the porch, she glanced over to the meadow where she sometimes saw Nathaniel standing by himself. And there she stopped. She gazed through the opening in the trees towards the field, wondering, why did he go there? Why that particular meadow? If he was reluctant for her to see him crying, then why didn't he go into the barn or the mill where she could not see him? What refuge did the meadow provide his weeping soul? Curious, she turned and walked towards the opening in the trees. To her surprise, the hair on her arms began to rise up. Her temples began to pound. Something was telling her to stop, to not go into the meadow. She paused, debating whether she should listen to the warnings, but she didn't want to stop. She wanted to know. She walked into the center of the meadow, a small green field dotted with purple-fringed orchids, a lively flock of chirping goldfinches and shimmering blue buntings feasted on the cone flowers that drooped in the long rays of the setting sun. Then she noticed something on the ground at the far end of the meadow. As she walked towards it, her heart beat slow and steady. At first, she could not make it out, for it lay in the shade of an old, gnarled, black cherry tree with long limbs that hung low over the grass. But then she began to see. Someone had laid stones on the ground in the shape of a large rectangle. Inside the rectangle there was a single mound of dirt. The mound had been swept clean of sticks and other debris, and it appeared as if someone had carefully smoothed the dirt with their bare hands. Periwinkle and ivy had been planted all around, and bunches of flowers from the meadow and the nearby forest had been laid alongside. At the end of the mound stood a cross made of wood, and beside the cross there were 3 other crosses, side by side in the grass, one after the other. She swallowed. Suddenly she felt very small, like a leaf floating in the wind, without will or destiny other than to just fall to the ground. These are human graves, she thought. Each of the 4 crosses had a small wooden plaque carved with day folk markings. She stared at the markings for a long time, but she could not read them. Suddenly there was a part of her that felt as separated from Nathaniel's world as she had ever been. But there was another part of her deeper down that felt their connection and knew that at this moment in the flow of time there wasn't another person in the world who was closer to him than her. They had become twins of the soul. As she walked slowly back to the house, lost in her thoughts, she knew she shouldn't ask Nathaniel about the graves. She shouldn't ask about the names that were on them. She shouldn't ask about what happened before she arrived. It would destroy everything. The next afternoon, when Nathaniel and Scout finally returned from Gatlinburg, Scout dashed across the yard and ran up to her, his tail wagging excitedly. "Hello, Scout," she said cheerfully as she knelt, put her arms around him, and hugged him. "Welcome home." Her heart swelled. She glanced up to Nathaniel, but his face was more worn and haggard than she had ever seen it. She expected bright news of his journey, but when their eyes met, he just shook his head in discouragement and walked on towards the house. After putting his rifle and supplies away, he trudged into the mill and went to work, clanking and banging as if he were smashing thoughts from his brain. When he came out of the mill, he went to the woodpile and split logs with his axe in a fit of violence, slamming his blade down harder and harder with each chop until there were no more logs to split. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table and ate their dinner, she watched him warily, wondering if his dark mood had passed. He ate his venison piled high with relish of mashed up squash, apples, and honey, and shoveled heaps of sweet corn succotash into his mouth. But he made no comments and asked no questions. "The other day," she said tentatively, "you were making marks with a stick on the skin of a tree." I was using a pencil to write letters on a piece of paper, he explained, and she could tell by the tone of his voice that he didn't mind talking. What do the letters represent? She asked. Does each one have a meaning? No, not exactly, he said as he cut another piece of meat and put it in his mouth. Each letter is a sound. How can that be when the skin of the dead tree is dead and the letters are silent? I'll show you, he said as he left the table and went upstairs. She heard his boots as he walked down the length of the hallway. He returned a few minutes later with a set of wooden blocks. This is called an A, he said, holding up one of the letters. It represents the sound ah, like the word apple. Each letter represents a sound that we write on the paper so that people can understand what we're saying to them. Even though they are not there, she said, amazed by the magic of it. Nathaniel nodded, pleased with her reaction, and picked up another letter. This one here is an H. It makes a sound, like the beginning of the word home. What is that one? She asked, pointing to a letter that looked like one she'd seen on the plaques by the graves. It appeared to be a jumble of 3 sticks. That's a K, like the beginning of the word kitten. You see, the alphabet contains all the different sounds. Willa paused, trying to understand. So, any word can be made from these letters? Yes. What about foreign words? Yes, I reckon so. What about the name Willa? How do you spell that? Willa, he said, then wrote the letters on the paper so she could see what they looked like. And what about Aloha? She asked at his uncertainty. Did you say Aliu? She said. Aloha. Is that a name? Yes. Well, the beginning of the name might be spelled Alley or Alli. He said, but I'm not sure about the ending. Maybe an EW or just a W. So it might be Alliw. She watched as he carefully wrote the letters out with his pencil for her to see. She looked at the 2 names side by side. Willa and Alliw. Twins, she thought. My sister and I were twins, even in our sounds and our letters, like the left hand and the right hand painted on the wall in the cave. So, how do you spell nay? She asked next. I would imagine you would spell it N-E-A, he said, and wrote the letters for her. You see, you've seen the A before, but the E and the N are new. The N is n. Do you hear it? I hear it, she nodded, mystified and satisfied at the same time. Is this nay a friend of yours? He asked. Maybe a bumblebee or a squirrel? No, she said with a smile, knowing that he was joking with her. Nay was my mother, and Aloha was my sister. Oh, I'm sorry, I see, he said. They're beautiful names, Willa. She looked at her for a second, as if he wasn't sure if he should ask her more questions. And they passed away 6 years ago. Is that right? He asked tentatively. My parents and my sister died when I was 6, she said, but did not say the rest, that it had been his people, human beings, who had been killed. I'm so sorry, Willa, he said, saying it with such sympathy. It was almost like he knew the truth of it. Sometimes she wondered how they had been killed, why they had been killed. Had it been the metal clanging newcomers with their saws and their axes? Had it been a homesteader like him with a killing stick? Whenever she tried to think about her parents and her sister, she kept seeing images of them running through the forest and then the darkness of the underworld of Dead Hollow. Frightened, she tried to change the subject. What about the sound a bear makes when it's happy because it's found a log full of honey? Or the voice of a tree when it whispers in the wind? Can the English letters make those sounds as well? Ah, he said, uncertain. I think you got me on those, but most of the other sounds, that folk like us might make? Willa nodded, smiling. What's so funny? He asked. Folk like us, she repeated. I like that. He smiled in return, understanding. So why all the questions about letters all of a sudden? Do you want me to teach you how to read? As long as I can hear your voice, why would I need to read? She said. It would let you hear other people's voices, their stories, he said. Like who? People who are no longer living who live outside the mountains. Willa tried to understand what Nathaniel was saying to her. Could these letters of the English truly bring voices from outside the world? Could they truly bring back the voices of people who had died? I'm not explaining it very well, he said. Let me try again. People write down things, and then later other people can read them. I might write down the story of what has happened in my life, or I might write down a story that I imagine in my head, or I might write a letter to someone who lives in a different place, or a message to tell you how I feel about something. Willa carefully listened to everything he said. By the flickering of a candle made from the wax of the bees, they talked long into the night of letters and sounds and stories told. Later, she sat in front of the fireplace with Scout lying across her lap, as he usually did, and gazed into the glowing embers of the sleeping fire. As Nathaniel roasted chestnuts in a black iron skillet over the simmering coals, he reminisced that he had learned how to farm vegetables and plant trees from his grandfather, how to cook meals and roast chestnuts from his mother, and how to read and write from his grandmama. Many years ago, when he was growing up, they had all lived in the house together. The following morning, when Nathaniel grabbed his rifle and headed out on his daily journey down the river, she wanted to tell him that she had gone down to the river after him while he was gone. But she didn't. She wanted to say, "What are you looking for out there? I've been down that river. There is nothing to find there." But she didn't. She didn't question him or push him. She didn't want to upset him or anger him. There were no more logs to split. But she knew there was one thing she needed to tell him before he left. "I heard the loggers in the distance yesterday," she said. "You heard them?" he asked. "Far off, but getting closer," she said. "I understand," he said, nodding gravely. "So, be careful," she said, looking at him as steadily as she could. "I will," he said, and then turned and began his journey. The threat of the loggers had clearly disturbed him, but he still had to go. She watched Nathaniel disappear into the forest. When she was sure he was gone, she went outside and walked over to the meadow. The morning mist was rising from the dew-covered grass, and bright yellow swallowtail butterflies were fluttering over the field of purple-fringed orchids. She stepped into the rectangle of stones, careful not to disturb them, then sat down in front of the first cross. She studied the letters that had been carved into the plaque. The first letter she recognized. "Apple," she said. The second letter looked like two vertical pine trees with a horizontal branch in between them. She was pretty sure that was the sound Nathaniel had told her about. The third looked like two twig saplings sprouting from the ground. The fourth looked like the moon. The fifth like a kitten. And the sixth was another apple. She tried to sound out each letter one at a time, and then she tried to blend them together. It came out sounding like a garbled mess. But as she sat beside the grave in the rectangle of stones and studied the letter on the cross, she knew that she could not give up. The name was the path she must follow. That evening, when the man Nathaniel returned from his trek down the river, he looked bitterly defeated. His eyes cast down and his teeth clenched, like he'd been walking all day up and down the river, searching and searching, but never finding. As he came out of the forest, his left hand gripped his rifle, and his right hand opened and closed repeatedly into a pumping fist. "He's angry," she thought. "He's going to clank around the mill, or go cut down a tree with his axe, or commit some other act of violence. I'm sure of it." But then, as he walked across the grass towards the house, he lifted his eyes and saw her standing there on the porch. The frustration and the fury lifted from the lines of his face. The change in his mood was like the passing of a storm from the rocky heights of a great mountain. He looked at her with his bright blue eyes, suddenly filled with something that was not anger, and not rage, and not sadness. And he said, "I'm glad to be home." And with that, we come to the end of chapter 48. And next time, we will continue finding out the adventure in Willa of the Wood.